Hello and welcome to episode number 443 of the Armen Show Podcast. Science, people, creativity, learning more, connecting with past discussions, advancing forward in time. We are in 2025. My guest here today is the author of a cool book with alliteration in the name, Mindmasters. We have Dr. Sandra Matz. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me today.
I'm glad to have you on. You are speaking about the mind in the book, talks about data, gets into the mind psychology, quite a bit on Big Five, which is cool. I look into that a fair amount. I've looked into that for many years, frankly, so that interested me quite a bit. Let us know a bit about how you got to exactly where you are today and what led to the writing of this book.
But it's a long journey. How much time do you have? I'm going to try to keep it somewhat short. So I am a psychologist by training. So I was always fascinated by human behavior. Why do we do the things that we do? How do we get to the preferences that we have? And it's funny because as a psychologist, I think when I started, it felt like this promise of you really understanding the human mind and you understanding human behavior as it unfolds in everyday life and like our natural interactions that we have. And to some extent, when I started psychology and studying psychology, I was almost like a little bit disappointed because the way that we typically used to study the mind was we give people questionnaires, we ask them for their self-assessments, or we invite them to the lab and we have them run through these controlled experiments where they press a bunch of buttons on the laptop, and then we assume that this tells us something about how psychology and behavior unfolds in the real world. And so for me, there was always almost like this disconnect between the promise of psychology as a behavioral science and the actual reality, where we didn't really look at behavior. So when I did this exchange year in England at the University of Cambridge, and there was this group of people who had really just started combining psychology, so the questions that we ask the psychologists, with computational methods. So instead of giving you questionnaires, instead of you having you press a bunch of buttons, they were looking at the data that people generate, starting with social media, right? All of the data traces that you put out there, like what you talk about, the experiences that you have, like what you like, what you put, and so on. And for me, this was like a fascinating field of research because it felt like we were suddenly really looking into people's daily experiences. And we've expanded this since not just social media, but anything from your credit card spending to like the data that's captured by your smartphone, right? Kind of tapping into your GPS records. We know where you are at any given point in time, what you do, your browsing history, your Google searches. So really taking these digital traces and using them to learn something about psychology. And the way that the reason for why I started writing the book was trying to make it more accessible for people. So I, like as researchers, we publish our papers and then maybe a handful of people, of other scientists in the field read them. And I started writing these stories for my parents and friends at home because I wanted them to, well, both get excited about the stuff that I was doing, but also learn a little bit more just about how intimate their personal data really can be and what this means for others once you can peek into someone's psychology just by observing data. So that's a little bit of like why I got so excited about this intersection of psychology and computer science and why I eventually decided to write the book.
You mentioned stories there. There are stories in the book. Stories are very compelling and can tell something that you can't just do if you did it in a bullet point set or a list. When it's a story, people can connect to it. Oh, okay, that was happening there, that led to that. Can you tell us the power of stories in describing what you figure out through this kind of research?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think of stories is, as you said, it makes it relatable. And that's also how I think about the general idea of psychology, right? So like, why do we need to translate someone's data into something that makes sense at a psychological level, like personality, values, like your moral foundations, like mental health? It's typically because as humans, we have a hard time relating to how intimate our data is, right? If I just tell you, I capture all of your GPS records, which is a bunch of longitude, latitudes, doesn't feel that intimate. If I tell you, well, I look at all of the TikTok videos that you've watched, doesn't feel that intimate. And it's because that's not how we think of ourselves, right? And how we describe other people. We describe other people in the context of narratives. There's someone who's more extroverted, more neurotic, more impulsive. And it's like taking this more holistic picture of a person and really putting it in context and in this narrative of who that person is in the given context that they're embedded in. So for me, narratives are both powerful as science communication tools, right? If we spend so much time and effort going through these research projects, we invest a whole lot of money that's oftentimes coming from taxpayer money into generating insights, but we oftentimes don't really communicate them. But it's not just science communication. For me, it's also one of the reasons for why this research was appealing to me in the first place, because I was trying to tell like the human story of data that goes beyond just these individual data points.
There's a disconnect between where data started and we're capturing these little tidbits of on off of this person did this, did not do this. And then now we're getting closer to connecting that to who that person is. And if algorithms are really strong, it's really showing who the person is, because let's say somebody's on TikTok for 6 hours a day, you're getting a pretty good idea of 1/4 of their whole day and half of their waking day, or 1/3, or something like that. So it's really being quite informative at this point. How much can we describe that to people as this progresses such that they can know, okay, this is who you are, or do they already know who they are?
It's a great question. I mean, so for me, first of all, I think oftentimes when we think about data and we think about the power of algorithms, we gravitate towards social media, right? Because that's what's top of mind. That's what all of the news are talking about. But data is so much more, right? So we're not just capturing the time that you're on TikTok. You carry your smartphone with you like pretty much 24/7, right? So it's very rare that the smartphone leaves our side. And if it does, we have a panic attack right away. But that means that someone captures data about you 24/7, right? It's like this person looking over your shoulder, understanding exactly where do you live? Easiest thing to infer, because that's where your phone is at home at night and it's stationary. We know where you work. We know potentially who you meet, because that's phone showing up in the same location at the same time. Swipe your credit card and we have a good sense of like, what do you buy, your daily habits, your routines, your preferences. Again, just typing something into Google search bar reveals a lot. So for me, there's actually so much more beyond social media. And the question is, like, to what extent does that give us accurate insights into someone's psychology, right? It's not just describing to people, here's what a computer thinks or who a computer thinks you are, but it's like a question of like, how accurate are those predictions? And there's this study that I really like that was done by one of my colleagues at Cambridge, where she essentially tried to capture accuracy of these algorithms, not by throwing out numbers, right? Typically, we talk about correlations and we talk about accuracies and area under the curve that nobody can relate to. What she did is she said, like, well, why don't we compare the accuracy of a computer at predicting your personalities? In this case, we're talking about the big 5 personality traits, as opposed to people in our environment who should know us pretty well. So that could be, say, coworkers, friends, family members, all the way to the spouse. And what she showed is that just by accessing, in this case, the Facebook pages that you follow, a computer was better than everybody, better than friends, better than coworkers, better than family members. And those people should know us pretty well, right? This includes siblings, that includes parents, that includes kids. Still, the computer, just by accessing your Facebook likes or the Facebook pages that you follow, was better than everybody except for the spouse. And now extrapolate to the fact that computers can now, or algorithms, now have access to so much more data than just like this tiny sliver of your social media presence. Chances are that they're probably even better than your most significant other. What I should say is that they're never perfect, right? So I think oftentimes we think of these, because we're not trained to think in probabilities. We think of it as like deterministic. If an algorithm says you're extroverted, that's the label that we go with, forgetting that the likelihood that you're extroverted is high. That doesn't make you extroverted. So the reason for why this matters, in my opinion, is that the moment that you make decisions based on these predictions, that's when you should factor in the notion that there's error, right? If you reject someone from a job because you predicted that they're not really organized and reliable, the margin of error that you accept should be tiny, tiny, tiny. because making a mistake there can be costly. Same as like when you reject someone for a loan and so on. So this notion that computers, based on our data, can know us pretty well never comes with a statement of they don't make any mistakes, and we're certain that they're getting it right.
Very important point here. It's almost, I think, of nuance. You have to be able to see if something is 65% something, that doesn't mean it is the whole thing 100%.
Exactly.
That's the averaging or the totaling that the common person might do, and then that negates the 35% that's not there or sometimes doesn't happen. It's like when the rain says 65% chance of rain. So 65% of the area will rain. It's not that it won't. I didn't describe that the best, but it means that it's not guaranteed, but also it is not guaranteed.
You might still influence. It might still influence your behavior, right? So 65% chance of rain might tell you should take an umbrella, but it doesn't mean that you have to kind of rely on this 100%. So I think the same is true in the context of these predictions that we make about individuals. What it should get you to think about is how much of error are we willing to still accept to make a decision based on this. And oftentimes also what's the counterfactual, right? If you think about the mental health context, for example, if we don't have any tool to detect whether someone might be suffering from depression, then even an algorithm that is better than chance and gives us some indication, some kind of early warning system that someone might be struggling is still better than nothing. So it really kind of comes to the counterfactual. If the weather forecast is 65% accurate, but you're at 50% and you can just flip a coin, then you might still want to go with the weather forecast.
That's a valid point. Now, connecting these two, let's say the big five has ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. We are getting more data. We are figuring out more about ourselves in the background. Is the average person going to soon be able to tell I am exactly this based on some of the things they are watching and seeing on a regular basis?
So for me, the interesting part is that we're moving a little bit beyond this notion that everybody has just like one big five profile, right? So if you look at the history of personality psychology, there was always like this clash with social psychologists where personality psychologists were, well, our behavior that's determined by our disposition. There's like some of it is genetic, some of it is nurture, the way that we're raised. But typically we have like this profile that predicts behavior across different situations. And so it's really a function of the person of how we behave. And then the social psychologists were like, no. It's all dependent. It's all a function of the situation. Forget about the person. Like if we're put in the same situation with the same triggers and the same cues, we're all going to behave in a certain way. And I think what we've learned over the years, not so surprisingly, is that it's a function of both, right? There's a tendency in that's how we think of personalities. It's a tendency to behave in a certain way, but then it's also influenced by situations. And I think what we've learned over the way that we've reconceptualized personality is instead of saying that there's like this point estimate where we say, well, you're 80th percentile on extroversion and it's always going to be the same, we think of it as a distribution of personality states. So most of the time, maybe you're really extroverted, right? Because that's like your tendency and your dispositional personality. But then you're probably even more extroverted when I put you in a bar with friends. There's music playing and there's just like a lot of stimulation and a lot of excitement happening. And you're probably less extroverted than you typically are when you sit at home or when you're stuck in the library and there's just not much going on. So the way that we can now not only predict your tendency with data, right? So if I get access to your social media data and so on, I can probably get a good sense of your general tendency, so like the 80%. What I can do if I capture data more in real time is actually complement this insight by saying, okay, I understand that typically you're an 80%, but I also know based on your phone's GPS location and the fact that I can map that location against Google Maps and see that you're currently hanging out in a bar, and we know that this bar at this time is typically crowded and there's live music playing. And I maybe can even map it against everything I can see from Google and know that there's an event happening that's like a live band playing. I get a much better sense of like, okay, maybe you're actually at 90% right now, because that's what the situation dictates. So what we've learned over the past few years is really that the more data we capture, not just historically looking back, but in real time, the better we are at pinpointing, like here's how you currently think of yourself when it comes to personality and some of these other psychological dimensions.
I like that you brought up the distribution. Many times over the years, I've talked to a variety of people, which was mentioned, by the way, by Juliana Schroeder, who is one person that you also check on.
Yeah.
I talked with her once about that. And when I socialize with people, I would check if they're introverted or extroverted. And some people would have one that they would pick, but some would say, I can't really pick. I'm in the middle.
Yeah.
And it leans more towards that there is a curve, and it might lean in the 40th or the 60th percentile from introversion to extroversion. But that means that there's a rough area of times where they're likely to be extroverted. So then they don't want to say they're not. And then there's maybe a slightly more often that they're introverted, but they don't want to exclude this portion. So then they might say, I'm an ambivert, which is a common response.
And it's nice because it makes us a little bit more dynamic, right? So I think there's this notion that someone can measure our personality, put us in a box, and that's where we stay, and just puts a label. I think most people don't like that because most people feel more complex than that. And they're right, because we're not always the same. It very much depends. We have like a core identity, right? We're also not completely malleable depending. We're not like just a completely different person today than we are tomorrow, but there's still something that makes us, I would say, more complex and also more interesting. And I think that's what people appreciate about the notion that you can both have a core tendency, but also like a legitimate reason to deviate from the tendency that's not just being inauthentic.
This is true. I used to use it quite a bit, Big Five or Myers-Briggs, to have some sort of heuristics of what people were like, and it helped me a bit. But as time has gone on, then I didn't deviate to that as often. It was just helpful as a baseline in some way. But then
that's true.
Once you get to know more, then there's more range to work with.
Yeah. And I think that's also true for the predictions that we make. So the way that I think of the Big Five personality traits is if you meet someone on the street that you've never met before, knowing their Big Five personality profile is helpful, right? Because it just gives you, again, a sense of how they might behave across different situations. The moment that you know someone better, you can almost throw the Big Five out the window. Because I don't think of my spouse as like, oh my God, he's like super extra. I kind of know all of the nuances of his behavior, right? And that kind of allows me to integrate into a much more complex picture of who he is. But the Big Five is just a very good and pragmatic starting point to understand people's behavior across different situations if you don't know more about them.
I like that you mentioned it's a starting point. It's not the end result. Like, that's an O, low C, high A, high E, low N individual. And there's not much room to work with at that point.
Which is what a lot of the personality tests, right? Like think of the Myers-Briggs, which is not a great test to start with, but it gives people a label and it's super static. And it's very simple. And people attach so much of their identity to these 4 letters, whereas there's like so much more to it, right? And so I'm always amazed by how much people cling to these like very simplistic descriptions of who they are. And maybe that's because it gives us a tribe that we belong to, right? If you have your 4-letter code, you can suddenly have like this or higher order identity of people that you can connect with, but it's certainly oversimplistic.
An added point related to that, I used to go to a forum that was related to my psychology grouping, and it was cool, but I didn't really relate too much, and it didn't have the impact of finding, oh, these are my individuals and we're all going to do this together now. So it doesn't do that for us. If all our data is being collected across many different ways and not just on social media, all kinds of maps and locations and what we purchase, is there anything that we can do to use that data to help us along the way? Or is this more others are checking on it and then adjusting things in the background?
Yeah, I'm also great. And I've been thinking about this a lot, right? Because the way that data is typically used is, as you described, is like a third entity that's collecting it. And in a way, they're profiting and benefiting from it because they can now shift your behavior by tapping into your psychology. The classic example is marketing, right? If I understand your psychology, the chances that I can sell you products that I want you to buy, and by either recommending the products that I think are relevant or adjusting the language, is just like much higher. Now, I do think that there's many different contexts where it can absolutely benefit us. And that's, it's usually the case when we we have an intention and we just have a hard time implementing the intention, right? So saving is one of these examples where most of us know that we should be putting a bit more money to the side. It's just really damn hard because it's not what the brain is good at, right? You have to give up something in the here and now for something that might happen in the future or not. So this is one of the examples, like one of the studies that we've conducted, which is essentially kind of trying to say, can we use the same strategies that marketers use to tap into your psychology to sell you more? Can we use those to actually help you save more? So in this particular example, we teamed up with a fintech company that's helping low-income individuals save more. And the goal was to really work with people who had a hard time saving. So people, in our case, less than $100 in savings in their account. And we try to encourage them over the course of 4 weeks to put an additional $100, which, again, it might not sound that much, but it's like essentially doubling the savings for the people in our cohort. And the way that we did this was trying to understand the big 5 personality traits of the people that we were working with. And then saying, well, if you're someone who's agreeable, right, if you're someone who cares about their social relationships, is caring, is trusting, is empathetic, I'm probably not going to convince you to put some money to the side just for the sake of having more money and getting ahead of the game. What you care about are your social relationships. So I'm much more successful if I can tell you, like, well, the reason for why you might want to put some money on the side right now is because that gives you an opportunity to protect the people that you love now and in the future. So it's really kind of trying to understand what makes saving relevant and important to people, and then playing into these motivations. Mental health context, I think, is another big one where there's so much opportunity for both understanding someone's psychology and then potentially also helping people who we know are suffering from something like anxiety, depression, because there's this, like, if you think about the way that we currently diagnose mental health issues, it's usually when it's already too late, someone is already kind of in the valley of depression, and it's, first of all, really hard to then reach out and get the support that you need because you're so inward focused, and it's also really hard to get out again because you're now in this valley and you have to kind of work your way up. Ideally, we'd have this, I think of it as like an early warning system where we kind of see that there's deviations from your typical routine, your typical behavior, and there's many ways to measure that, right? They could be, we tap into your smartphone, we see that you don't leave the house as much as anymore as you used to do it, as much as physical activity. Maybe you're not making calls as much anymore as you used to. And it's not a diagnosis, but it's like a potential indication that, yeah, something seems to be off. You're not your typical self. Why don't you look into like getting some support? And that support, if you think about generative AI and like new technology, can also be to some extent facilitated with technology, and especially in the cases where people don't have access at all, right? Is it going to replace therapists? Probably not, because there's still something somewhat unique about just seeing another person and talking through it, knowing that there's someone on the other side who doesn't just mimic empathy, but actually feels how we feel. But that's not true for most of the people. So for every 100,000 people looking to get mental health support, there's 13 mental health professionals around the world. So there's this huge gap in supply and demand. And you can imagine that for all of the people who don't have access to a mental health professional at all, having an AI, even though it might not be perfect and it gets it wrong sometimes, and it's not just as great as like real therapists, still a much better option than not having anything at all. So I think there's huge potential for data and AI to be used to help us accomplish the goals that we have, rather than just being exploited by third parties.
Many great points you brought up there. One that came to mind early on was that the data can be used to lower if it was a chemical reaction, the activation energy. So instead of the friction at that first part to save money or to make a life effort, you drop that energy required, and it helps you out in some way, whether through a chat program or a person or a resource. And now the thing that you wanted to get from here to the other side, the hump is much lower, and then off you go towards there. Whereas before, the friction was higher, maybe unnecessarily, and that's a big value the data can bring.
Yeah, and I think it just adds motivation, right? So it's like such a fundamental human principle. The way that we always communicate with the people around us is to some extent personalized. I mean, I think of kids, right? Kids very quickly figure out that if you want candy, you ask your mom in a certain way, and you maybe ask your dad in a different way. So any kind of interpersonal communication, conversation that we have that's with another human is personalized because we understand who's on the other side, or at least we try, and then we adjust our communication to make it to increase the likelihood that they're actually going to do what we want them to do. And the same is true for data. The more that you understand, the better you are positioned at influencing the direction that they go in.
This point is very valuable to me because for a long time I've noticed this speaking the language concept. You want to speak the language of who you are reaching. And when there's a gap, you are saying, I would like you to do this. And the other person is thinking, well, that's not valuable because of this. And this is actually more valuable. So 90% of your effort is down the drain because that's not how the person is hearing. Whereas data can connect these two.
Yeah.
So AI is helping with that because when you talk to it, it's actually hearing you as you. Whereas let's say you're talking with a friend or family member, they might have a goal for you or something, an outcome they want to happen, not hearing what you're saying or the vision you might have for the future. And that gap just floats into nothingness.
Yeah, it's funny because there's this there's like this thing that I always say is like sometimes it actually pays off to be a little bit less human because for exactly the same reason that you mentioned, right? We have our own motivations, we have our own incentives, and we also have our own outlook on the world, right? So there's like egocentrism bias where we just see the world through our own lens is real. And this is also true for how we try to persuade other people. There's this research on like essentially showing that when we try to craft a persuasive argument, we craft it based on our own values. Think of politics, right? If like Democrats try to convince Republicans about something, they usually frame it with the values that Democrats like in mind. Whereas what they should be doing is step into the other side's shoes and say, well, how would they think about the problem? But it's so hard for humans to do because we do have this lens and we do have all of the motivations to kind of act in a certain way. And it's not true for algorithms. Algorithms can really just say, who's on the other side? I don't have any incentive. I don't have a motivation. All I want is to understand the other side and craft the argument in a way that most resonates with them. So you're absolutely right in that there, the being a little bit less human is actually an advantage when it comes to persuasion.
This is an important detail of the psychology that causes it to be that way, that a person, maybe a 12-year-old, is watching TikTok more than listening to their parents because TikTok's algorithms behind the scenes are speaking to them way more than their parents are. And that's the basic thing is what you're saying. But if their parents were talking to them the way they were wanting to be heard, they would much rather have a person right there with them that warmly cared about them.
That's true. Even though the parents can't always say, yeah, you should totally have the candy. And there's also like a reason for why they don't always agree.
Right, in that case. But let's say that little individual wants to do some sort of research, and that's a long-term plan. And then so I want some sort of creative insights, but here it's just not creative. Then I am not being incentivized, and then here it is fitting. So then that works out in some cases. Do people take more control of their data? Is it not really a thing because there's so much already? I've talked about this before where privacy has pretty much been handed off because everything is accessible. Is there any sort of controlling one's data, or what does one do in that regard?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've become a lot more pessimistic about our own ability to control and manage our data on a day-to-day basis. So I think for a long time, I was very much in line with some of the new data protection regulations, like the European Union, for example, which focus very much on transparency and control. So the idea here, if I explain to you what's happening with your data and I empower you to manage the data yourself, again, take it from one place to another, kind of delete it and so on, you're going to be able to do that. I think those principles are super important. I think they're absolutely necessary. I don't think they're enough. I don't think they're sufficient because the problem is that that's why I've become a lot more pessimistic, is that the technology moves so fast that it's almost impossible to keep up with the latest developments. And it would be a full-time job, right? If you really take protecting your privacy seriously, you would have to read through all of the terms and conditions, kind of every single permission that you give, think for all of the products that you're using, all of the services. that would be a 24/7 full-time job, and nobody has the time and capacity, right? Hopefully we have better stuff to do than just reading through the 100th kind of terms and conditions every day. So for me, if we really want to change something and we want to protect people's privacy and also their ability to make their own choices, right? It's like, because it's not just invading your privacy, it's also meddling with the choices that you make. It just needs somewhat more systemic changes, and that can come from regulation, right? If we were to change the default from an opt-out, where you actively have to make sure that your data isn't being tracked with all of the products and services, which nobody is going to do, to an opt-in. And again, that makes it easy. And the baseline option is that nothing gets tracked unless you actively say so, would be a totally different baseline, because now the default is you're protected, and companies have to convince you that you signing away your data makes the product so much better that you say, okay, I'm good with that. There's also technologies that I think are really promising in that space, which kind of alleviate this dichotomy between, or they essentially eliminate the trade-off between privacy and then convenience, service, and personalization, because they don't require to collect the data for you to get the insights. Siri, for example, like Apple's speech recognition on iPhones and their Apple products, is trained locally. So it's called federated learning. And the idea is that instead of you having to send all of your speech data to Apple, where they on a central server process it, they learn how to listen to your language, respond to it adequately. What they do is they send the intelligence. So they send a model to your phone where it gets locally updated. So the data never leaves your phone. It just makes use of the fact that this is a supercomputer, right? This is like so much more powerful than the rockets that we use to launch, like the computers that we used to launch rockets to space with just a few decades ago. So it just locally updates. Your data never leaves the phone, but you still get the intelligence. And you can also send the intelligence back to Apple in form of a model and say, okay, now we kind of have a better sense of how to recognize the voice of like X, and with like all of these different contexts. Now we learn something for the overall model, so we all benefit, but it still means that your data itself is always protected, because Apple never gets hold of it in the first place. So for me, this notion of we just ask people to manage their privacy and then we hope for the best, I think that's it's a bit of a dead end. I'd much rather see this more systemic changes that protect people by default.
I see this happening what you're describing more often now, where the data is put into a little box for usage, the processing is done on it. The output can be for the public or the users, but the data you used for it or how you segmented it, that is of your choosing and cannot be seen. And then you can have it behind an encrypted some sort of base. Yep. And then outside can check. Let's say you make a chat bot from your various talks and whatnot. You put in the talks, you decide how it's going to be analyzed, and then the outside user can ask it questions. And then you could also limit what they would be able to ask it as well, for example.
Yeah, yeah, that's how I think about it. It's essentially, we're trading intelligence, we're not trading data, and companies can ask questions and answer our questions, but not necessarily collect the data itself.
I got quite a bit of thought into this recently. I was talking with Brian Jabarian at Booth Chicago, and he does a lot on economics and AI. And I told him about my show, and we met in person here. He was always repeating, like, but you have all this data, all the data that you have all this data, the things you could do with this data. And he mentioned it a lot of times, and I wasn't really processing it until maybe the 8th time. And then I'm like, that's a good point. That's a good point. There is a lot of communications and such. And I've been working with it lately with Notebook LM and a few others, where they can create almost a talk between, this is an upcoming thing. I can have an upcoming theoretical talk between yourself and a past guest of mine about material.
Yeah.
I saw that.
It's mind-blowing. It's just insane. I mean, I think the first one was, it's amazing at reading academic papers, but like brilliant, comes up with examples that were never in the paper, then kind of creates a podcast about the paper, and now can also kind of exactly, it's just like mind-blowing. It's not perfect, so I still think you have a job on the bright side, but it's definitely, I mean, yeah, impressive, frighteningly so almost.
I think it's great. I like anything that pushes the steps forward of society, because I've always thought there's more there. I've never gotten into the defending the thing of today, because I didn't ever really fully believe in the thing of today anyway. So there's that. But then I see a lot of where there's individuals where, well, we did this thing for the past 2 years. It can't go. But it's only been here for 2 years. We're defending a thing that was just you just saw it. And then like if my phone, and now I'm like fighting and holding my phone, but 10 years ago it wasn't there. What was I doing before that? There's a bit of holding to what was.
Well, I guess there's also like a little bit of a protecting the vulnerable. So I think the moment that there's market incentives that benefit companies from exploiting individuals, it's very hard without any kind of oversight, whether that's regulation or technology, I think, to prevent this. And the best example is actually coming from within companies. So I have a lot of friends who work for like the big tech companies. And for them, it's really hard, right? Even if they have like very high ethical standards and principles, what they're saying is like, we would love to have regulation because that eliminates the constant competition of, well, if we do something that maybe is not using as much data, but it kind of destroys some of the value, which is not always true, but sometimes it is. But then the competition does it, so we can't do it, even though we would love to do the right thing. So I think it's not even, I don't think it's always like the big tech companies versus us. I think even from within, if you're not one of the major shareholders, I think even from within the companies, there's actually a lot of demand for saying we just need these more systemic levels of oversight, because if it's just a free marketplace, the incentives are just there to exploit most of the people who don't have a chance to defend themselves.
This is what happens in each category once it starts to build up, is that if you're a first mover or you're early on, then at some point you actually do want systems built in place for it, because those systems are built in place on top of what you're doing currently, so that makes you more stable, and then any outsider has to deal with that. It's nice to be there when things are then added, which is why in life it's good to be there. That's like the showing up is 80% of the item, because sometimes when you're there, the things show up for you. But if you weren't there and you're trying to catch up, you're always trying to catch up to that moment.
That's the excuse that my husband always uses to travel when I have to look after the baby. So I agree, but I constantly hear that one.
That's funny. That's a funny one. Long live the babies. Long live the babies out there. That is super cool. We could include that. You have a young child. How is that?
Yes.
Is that going well?
It's he's 1 year old. I think shout out to all the moms out there. It's a lot of hard work. I don't think I appreciated it as much as I did before. It's definitely hopefully going to turn out to be my masterpiece, but substantial effort along the way.
Mind masterpiece. Boom, combination.
Exactly.
What are 2 points? I always have curiosity. What are 2 points of I didn't think it was gonna be this from that year? Like
from 2025 already?
2 points of your year with your baby that you were
with
like,
the baby.
I didn't know that it would be this.
I mean, I think there's 2 things. One is that I didn't think it was going to be as magical, so that's the plus side. I think everybody told me once you have the baby, you're just going to fall in love, and it's going to be amazing, and it's hard to describe, but you'll feel it. And I was always like, I don't know. Like, who probably is like, I know that that's how Mother Nature planned it to be, but I'm not sure if that's really going to happen. Totally happened. So this was definitely a nice surprise. I think the one thing that I fully underappreciated is that all of my my calendar, like my meetings on the calendar will be a maybe for the next 18 years. I think I was like, once the baby is in daycare, I'm going to go back to my old life. Totally not the case, because there's so many contingencies. They get sick, can't go to daycare. So that was like definitely the rude awakening on the other side. It's magical and totally unpredictable.
That's informative right there. Right. You're like, wait, okay, I'll just start scheduling stuff again.
Exactly.
We have already gone through
18
that process.
years. Yes.
Onward we go. No, that's not what we're doing. Oh, that's not what we're doing. Okay. All right. I guess we're not scheduling that then. That's true. The prioritization. That's true.
It does change.
But good. So magical. Like you're like a magician at this point, basically.
I mean, like having a baby feels a little bit like magic. Yeah.
Oh, can you already see personality features? Does that show
I
up
think,
there?
well, we actually, so his name is Ben, and we
Ben.
called him Ben because he was so chill when he was born that we thought Zen Ben is just like a very, so I think he's sort of like, he's super curious, very calm, and just observant. I think he's like an open-minded introvert, but who knows?
That's cool. That came up real quick. That's that's neat. Who would have planned that? You can't plan those kinds of things.
Uh, well, it's
Will
like
he ever?
a lot of his genetics, so maybe I'm
Right.
just projecting some of my own
Does it match
traits.
one of you or your?
Probably matches me more than my husband.
Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. I've noticed a lot of traits. There's one strong force that caused that feature,
Yeah.
and in this
Yeah.
case, that's that one.
Well, he can still nurture him. There's still a lot of it is still how you raise it. So he's got a chance to have his influence there.
That's a cool part. The numbers, I checked the numbers across the earth of people getting together, having children, those kind of numbers, and there's a lot of discussion about it. Was there as much discussion about it before? Not as much, but we also didn't collect as much data before, and it wasn't as right there. We would be focused on other things maybe 50 years ago, and now it's not that. Now everything is more right there
In your
because we have data
face.
on shopping and where people are going and what's happening. So instead of it being just the happenstance, now if you really want to, any sort of feature is this is the number of people that like the color green, and it's this many people, this percentage. Yeah, it's much heavier than it was before. That's an interesting one. The process of writing the book is there the first part, the middle part, the last part? Where is the difficulty? Which part comes to mind first when you think about the process of writing the book?
Huh. Um, it's an interesting question because so I didn't have a book in mind when I started writing because I really just wrote these stories for my parents to explain to them and to get them to care. So for me, it almost came together relatively naturally because I had parts from the beginning, which is like talking about psychology and how does this entire technology or data to psychology work. But I'd also thought a lot about the last part, which is how do we deal with this? What are some of the paths forward that allow us to reap the benefits and mitigate some of the risks? So I think at the point that I started really writing the book, there were so many pieces already that it was almost like just a puzzle that I could put together. So I was in a good spot.
Are there any specific people that guided you in a direction toward the research that you do or the book writing? Are there any people that come to mind that you're like, what, this person?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of my research was inspired by Sam Gosling, who is psychologist, and he had done almost like the analogous work in the offline space. So he was one of the first people that looked at what can we learn about strangers from observing their physical environment. So he looked at, for example, if you enter someone's bedroom or you enter someone's office and you just snoop around and you kind of get a sense of like, here's a poster of someone, there's books in the background, exactly. You get a sense of maybe the desk is messy or it's like totally neat. Can we make accurate predictions about who those strangers are based on their physical environment? He has a book that's called Snoop. It's a very fun read. And we kind of almost took this and translated it into the digital space, right? Instead of looking at your office or your bedroom, we just snoop around your social media data, your credit card spending, your smartphone sensors. But a lot of the work has been inspired by Sam's work.
It's an interesting one here. How much can be figured out from afar? We're getting better at being able to, you almost don't need to ask a person a question directly, or you don't need to do as much direct analysis these days because there's indirect cues that tell you the items. So if you're sharp in 2025, I think there's a lot that can be figured out without having to, some people would say a long time ago, oh, it's uncomfortable to say this or this. You don't have to. I think you can skip some of these steps now and figure out, okay, this pattern leads to this. I've seen this before. A lot of do you believe that pattern recognition is our main thing that we do as people? Is that an important one? What do you think about pattern recognition?
I mean, if you think about what is AI good at, it's pattern recognition, right? So like AI is able to observe so much more data that we as humans do. What I think is interesting as humans is we do it extremely efficiently, right? So the human brain is so much more efficient than any algorithm or any computer-based model. So we're kind of pattern recognition machines, and we might not be as good at certain tasks, right? So we're extremely good at if once I know what a bike is, I can immediately spot it anywhere, right? I don't need to be trained like with millions and millions of pictures where someone labeled this is a bike, this is not a bike. We just know it. There's contexts where we're just not as good. So if you kind of give me a lot of numbers and ask me to predict the stock market, we have a much harder time. So there's like certain domains that we're extremely good at. That's like the intuitive pattern recognition, and then there's domains that we're just like evolutionarily not as important, like we're just interpreting numbers that we're not really good at. And it's interesting. We have this, like one of my research streams is actually trying to look at, can we translate some of the data sources that we're not as good as into more experiential forms of information? So if I give you numbers, for example, and I ask you to kind of see what's common to these numbers, or let's take a stock market predictions. That's not what we did, but that would be an applied example. I can give you the numbers, right? I can tell you everything about the market, and you have a hard time making predictions of whether a stock is you should buy or sell. If we give you, say, a vest that has like certain vibrations and kind of applies pressure depending on the data points, your brain actually over time is much better at picking up these signals. And because it's just something, we feel the environment, right? We don't think of like, oh, what's the humidity, what's like the temperature and the sun hitting we just think we feel it's warm. So what we know is that if you translate complex information like numbers into sensory experiences, the brain is actually much better at learning over time, right? And it's just like I turn on the vest and you feel like maybe there's like a pushing here and maybe it's like vibrating a little bit here. And you kind of in the beginning, it's trial and error. You just say like, I'm going to go left or I'm going to go right. And I give you feedback. I just constantly tell you that was a good decision, that was a wrong decision, that was right, that was wrong, that was right. And over time, you just learn how to interpret the signals. And you might not be able to articulate why you made those choices and why you think now you should be going left as opposed to right, but your brain has just picked up on these. So I think there's a lot of interesting, if you think of pattern recognition, a lot of interesting research to come on that front. That's just trying to leverage the amazing ability of the brain to make sense of data, but just not in the form that we're typically being fed when we kind of get numbers and spreadsheets.
This is directly related to research from 20 miles away or 15 miles away at Caltech that they kept showcasing this past month about we think at 10 bits per second, whereas the feel or our sensory intake is way more like you're describing. So if we're going to reach people in a very full way, that's a better way to go than getting into the processing way that we do our thinking way slower. So that'll be much more full, I would say.
Yeah. Well, my husband got his PhD at Caltech, so it's probably not a coincidence.
That is convenient. That is convenient. Super school. One of the great places out there.
Yeah.
He is there, and I didn't mention the institution you are at. Can you describe it and the features you like about it in relation to your work?
Well, so I'm right now at Columbia Business School, but with my husband, we have the Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance. So that's why we think a lot about these questions of like, how do we use technology to essentially help people overcome some of the mental limitations, cognitive limitations that we have. And we always compare it to the physical space, right? We kind of know and acknowledge that we have physical limitations. That's why we build airplanes to get us from A to B faster and further. That's why we have ACs and heating so we can survive in extreme cold and extreme heat. But we don't have a lot of these tools to help us with our cognitive abilities. So we're really thinking about how do we, again, use technology. Could be anything from how do we get people better who have something, again, like mental health issues, but then also how do we opt up performance using something like the sensory substitution research that I just mentioned. So it's really kind of trying to see how we can make technology work when it comes to amplifying our cognitive abilities.
Can this be a time, let's say 2024 or even now, where the vast majority of people can very quickly start to really figure things out about themselves if they're always interacting with data or a chat item and questioning things. I just feel like a rebirth of a lot of people using the new technology.
I mean, I don't think you need technology to figure out something about yourself, right? So sometimes it just kind of takes you sitting down, talking to other people, to figure something out. So I wouldn't necessarily ascribe it to technology. Do I think it's worthwhile doing? Absolutely.
That's a great way to put it. What is one message you would want people to take away from Mindmasters if you had a megaphone to all people?
I would say just realize that your data is so much more intimate than you might realize. And it's not just that by giving away your data, you're giving up privacy, but you're also giving up the ability to make your own choices and control your own life. So if you can, I would try and get your policymakers, wherever you are, to step up their game and try to make it a little bit easier for you to reap the benefits and not have others abuse your data against you.
That's a great point. Dr. Sandra Matz, I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode of the discussion about Mindmasters, psychology, what we do with our data, how it connects to us, and how intimate it is when looked at in detail.
Thank you so much for having me.
Glad to have you on, and we are out.